The Great Train Robbery was a robbery of 2.61 million, equivalent to 58 million present day, from a Royal Mail train heading from Glasgow to London on the West Coast Main Line in the early hours of the 8th of August 1963 at Bridgeo Railway Bridge, Ledburn, near Mentamore in Buckinghamshire, England. After tampering with the line sign signals to bring the train to a halt, a gang of 15, led by Bruce Reynolds, attacked the train. Other gang members included Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, Charlie Wilson, Roy James, John Daly, Jimmy White, Ronnie Biggs, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, Bob Welsh, and Roger Caudry, as well as 3 men known only as numbers 1, 2 and 3. 2 were later identified as Harry Smith and Danny Pembroke. A 16th man, an unnamed retired train driver, was also present. With careful planning based on inside information from the individual known as the Ulsterman, whose real identity has never been established. The bulk of the stolen money has never been recovered. They did not use any firearms, though Jack Mills, the train driver, was beaten over the head with a metal bar and suffered serious head injuries. After partial recovery, Mills returned to work doing light duties. He retired in 1967 and passed away in 1970 due to an unrelated illness. Mills never overcame the trauma of the robbery. After the robbery, they hid at Leatherslade Farm. The police found this hideout, and incriminating evidence, a monopoly board with fingerprints, led to the eventual arrest and conviction of most of the gang. The ringleaders were sentenced to 30 years in prison. The plan to intercept and rob the overnight Glasgow to London mail train was based on information from an unnamed senior security officer within Royal Mail, who had detailed knowledge of the amount of money carried. He was introduced to 2 of the criminals who would carry out the raid, Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards, by a London solicitor's clerk, Brian Field. The raid was devised over a period of months by Goody and Edwards, along with Bruce Reynolds and Charlie Wilson, with Reynolds assuming the role of mastermind. This gang, although very successful in the criminal underworld, had virtually no experience in stopping and robbing trains, so it was agreed to enlist the help of other London gang called the South Coast Raiders. The group included Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch and Jim Hussey, who were already accomplished train robbers. This group also included Roger Caudry, a man who was a specialist in this field and knew how to rig the trackside signals to stop them. Other associates, including Ronnie Briggs, who Reynolds had previously met in jail, were added as the organisation evolved. The final gang who took part in the raid comprised of a total of 16 men. At 6:50 p.m. on Wednesday the 7th of August 1963, the travelling post office, up special train, set off from Glasgow Central Station en route to Euston Station in London. It was scheduled to arrive at Euston at 4 a.m. the following morning. The train consisted of 12 carriages and carried 72 post office staff, who sorted mail during the journey. Mail was loaded on the train at Glasgow, during additional station stops en route, and from line-side collection points where local post office staff would hang mail sacks on elevated trackside hooks that were caught by nets deployed by the onboard staff. Sorted mail on the train could be dropped off at the same time. This process of exchange allowed mail to be distributed locally without delaying the train with unnecessary stops. One of the carriages involved in the robbery is preserved at the Nene Valley Railway. The second carriage behind the engine was known as the HVP coach, which carried large amounts of money and registered mail for sorting. Usually the value of the shipment was in the region of £300,000, but because the previous weekend had been a UK bank holiday weekend, the total on the day of the robbery was to be between 2.5 and 3 million. In 1960, the Post Office Investigation Branch recommended the fitting of alarms to all TPOs with HVP carriages. The recommendation was implemented in 1961, but HVP carriages without alarms were retained in reserve. By August 1963, 3 HVP carriages were equipped with alarms, bars over the windows and bolts and catches on the doors. But at the time of the robbery, these carriages were out of service, so a reserve carriage without those features had to be used. The fitting of radios was also considered, but they were deemed to be too expensive, and the measure was not implemented. This carriage was kept for evidence for 7 years following the event, and then burned in a scrapyard in Norfolk, in the presence of police and post office officials, to deter any souvenir hunters. The robbers tampered with a signal light on the West Coast Main Line at Sears Crossing, Ledburn, between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington, covering the green light with a glove and using a battery to power the red light. Just after 3 a.m. on the 8th of August, the driver, 58-year-old Jack Mills from Crewe, stopped the train at the signal. As the signal stop was unexpected at this time and place, the train's second crew member, 26-year-old David Whitby, also from Crewe, climbed down from the cab to call the signalman from a line-side telephone, only to find the cables had been cut. As he returned to the train, he was overpowered by one of the robbers. Meanwhile, the members entered the engine cabin from both sides. As Mills grappled with one robber, he was struck from behind by another and rendered semi-conscious. The robbers now had to move the train to Mentmore Bridge, approximately 800 metres further along the track, where they planned to unload the money. One of the robbers had spent months befriending railway staff and familiarising himself with the layout and operation of trains and carriages. Ultimately, though, it was decided that it would be better to use an experienced train driver to move the train. On that night, the gang's hired train driver, Stanagate, or Pete, was unable to operate this newer type of train, although having driven trains for many years. He was by then retired and was experienced only on shunting trains in the southern region. With no alternative available to them, it was quickly decided that Mills would have to move the train to the stopping point near the bridge, which was indicated by a white sheet stretched between poles on the track. Biggs' only task was to supervise Agate's participation in the robbery, and when it became obvious that Agate was not able to drive the train, he and Biggs were sent to the waiting truck to help load the mailbags. The train was stopped at Brideo Bridge, and the robbers' assault force attacked the HVP carriage. Frank Dewhurst was in charge of the other postal workers, Leslie Penn, Joseph Ware and John O'Connor in the HVP carriage. Thomas Kett, assistant inspector in charge of the train from the Carlisle to Euston, was also in charge. Dewhurst and Kett were hit when they made an attempt to stop the robbers. Once the robbers had entered the carriage, the staff could put up no effective resistance as there was no police officer or security guard on board. The staff were made to lie face down on the floor in the corner of the carriage. Mills and Whitby were then brought into the carriage, handcuffed together and put with the staff. Because a 30-minute limit had been set by Reynolds, the robbers removed all but 8 of the 128 sacks from the HVP carriage, which they transferred in under 20 minutes to the waiting truck. They departed in their Austin Lodestar truck around 30 minutes after the robbery began, and, in an effort to mislead any potential witnesses, they used 2 Land Rovers, both with a registration plate BMG 757A. They then headed along minor roads, listening for police broadcasts on a VHF radio, and arrived back at Leatherslade Farm at around 4:30. Leatherslade was a rundown farm between Oakley and Brill. It had been bought 2 months earlier as the hideout. At the farm, they counted the money and divided it into 16 full shares and several smaller shares. The full shares apparently came to approximately £150,000 each. From listening to their police-tuned radio, they learned that the police calculated that they had gone within a 30-mile radius of the crime. This declaration was based on the information given by a witness at the crime scene who stated that a gang member had told the post office workers not to move for half an hour. The press interpreted this information as a 30-mile radius as a half-an-hour drive in a fast car. The vehicles that they had driven to the farm could no longer be used as they had been seen by the train staff. Brian Field came to the farm on Thursday to pick up his share and to take Roy James to London to find an extra vehicle. Bruce Reynolds and John Daly picked up cars. Field, his wife Catherine and Mark brought the vans and drove the remainder of them to the Field home to recover. Field had arranged with Mark to carry out a comprehensive clean-up and set fire to the farm after the robbers had left, even though the robbers had already spent much time wiping the place down to be free of fingerprints. According to Buster Edwards, he nicked £10,000 to help pay Mark. On Monday, when Charlie Wilson rang Brian Field to check whether the farm had been cleared, he did not believe Field. He called a meeting with Edwards, Reynolds, Daly and James, and they agreed that they needed to be sure. They called Field to a meeting on Tuesday, where he was forced to admit that he failed to torch the farm. In an IVS 2012 documentary film, The Great Train Robbery, Bruce Reynolds' son, Nick Reynolds, said, "The guy who was paid to basically go back to the farm and burn it down did a runner." The robbers had cut all the telephone lines in the vicinity, but one of the railmen left on the train at Sears Crossing caught a passing goods train at Cheddington, where he raised the alarm at around 4:20 a.m. The first reports of the robbery were broadcast on a VHF police radio within a few minutes, and this is what they were heard on the line. "A robbery has been committed and you'll never believe it. They've stolen the train." Bruce Richard Reynolds was born on the 7th of September 1931 at Charing Cross Hospital, Strand, London, to Thomas Richard and Dorothy Margaret. His mother passed in 1935, and he had trouble living with his father and stepmother, so he often stayed with one of his grandmothers. Reynolds was jailed for 3 years on several counts of breaking and entering, and upon his release quickly started reoffending. He soon joined a gang with his best friend John Daly. They were mentored by Ernie Watts and Terry Hogan. He did some work with Jimmy White and met Buster Edwards at Charlie Richardson Club. Richardson, in return, introduced him to Gordon Goody. After the train heist, Reynolds escaped to Mexico with his wife, Angela, and young son Nick Reynolds, and lived lavishly with his share of the take. When the money ran out, Reynolds moved his family to Canada and then France under false identities in search of work before returning to the UK to pursue opportunities promised by old criminal contacts. He was arrested in 1968 in Torquay and sentenced to 25 years in jail. He was released a decade later. Reynolds was sent back to prison in the mid-1980s for dealing amphetamines. He produced occasional journalism pieces, was a consultant on a movie and book projects about the train heist, and published a well-regarded crime memoir, Crossing the Line, the Autobiography of a Thief, in 1995. In a 2003 interview, Reynolds recalled, "From an early age, I always wanted a life of adventure." He was rejected by the Royal Navy because of his poor eyesight, and then tried to become a foreign correspondent, but his highest achievement was a clerk at Daily Mail. While his life in crime did not provide excitement, Reynolds said in 2003, "I've always felt that I can't escape my past, and in many ways, I feel like there is a line from ancient mariner and that the notoriety has been like an albatross around my neck." Reynolds passed away at age 81 on the 28th of February 2013 after a brief illness. Of Northern Irish descent, Douglas Gordon Goody was born in Putney, London in March 1930 and was still living there in his mother's flat at the time of the robbery. In the early 1960s, he joined Buster Edwards' gang and helped rob various targets. Sentenced to 30 years for his role in the crime, he was released from prison in 1975. Goody then moved to Spain, where he ran a beachfront bar. In a September 2015 interview, Goody claimed the identity of the Ulsterman was Patrick McKenna, a postal employee. The interview was shown in a documentary marking the 50th anniversary of the robbery called The Great Train Robbery, A Tale of Two Thieves. The documentary makers employed social worker Ariel Bruce, who finds missing family members, to trace McKenna. Discovered after obtaining records through the Freedom of Information Act, McKenna had passed away some years previously. However, Bruce made contact with McKenna's family and obtained copies of photographs, which Goody confirmed to be the same person that he had met 50 years earlier. The documentary suggests that McKenna never benefited from the money, but instead gave it to the Catholic Church. It suggests that McKenna was motivated by the failure of the post office to provide better security for all the night train staff, and he hoped that the robbery would be a wake-up call. Goody passed away of emphysema on the 29th of January 2016 at the age of 85. The most dangerous was the silent man Charlie Wilson. He was born on the 30th of June 1932 to Bill and Mabel Wilson in Battersea. His friends from childhood were Jimmy Hussey, Tommy Whitby, Bruce Reynolds and Gordon Goody. Later on he met Ronald Buster Edwards and the young driving enthusiast Mickey Ball and Roy James, who had taken up car theft. From 1948 to 1950, he was called up for national service, and in 1955 he married Patricia Osborne, with whom he had 3 children. He turned to crime early in life. While he did have legitimate work in his in-law's grocer shop, he was also a thief, and his criminal proceeds were into buying shares in various gambling enterprises. He went to jail for short spells for numerous offences. In 1960, he began to work with Bruce Reynolds and planned to get into the criminal big league. Ronald Christopher Edwards was born on the 27th of January 1932 at Lambeth, London. After leaving school, he worked in a sausage factory, where he began his criminal career by stealing meat to sell on the post-war black market. During his national service in the RAF, he was detained for stealing cigarettes. When he returned to South London, he ran a drinking club and became a professional criminal. He married June Rose in 1952. They had a daughter, Nikki. In his final years, he ran a flower stall outside Waterloo Station in London. Brian Arthur Field was born on the 15th of December 1934. He served 2 years in the Royal Army Service Corps, seeing service during the Korean War. Although soldiers in the Service Corps were considered combat personnel, they were primarily associated with transport and logistics. He was discharged from the military. It was with a very good character. Field later became a solicitor's managing clerk for John Wheater & Co. Although he was only 28 at the time of the robbery, he was already apparently more prosperous than his boss, John Wheater. Field drove a new Jaguar and had a house with his wife at the Burdle Path, Whitchurch Hill, Oxfordshire, while his boss owned a battered Ford and lived in a run-down neighbourhood. Part of the reason for Field's prosperity was that he was not adverse to giving Goody and Edwards information about his clients and what they had in their country houses, making them prime targets for the thieves. On one occasion, he described the contents and layout of a house near Weybridge where his wife Corinne had once been a nanny. Prior to the robbery, Field had represented Buster Edwards and Gordon Goody. He had arranged Edwards' defence when he had been caught with a stolen car and had met Goody at a nightclub in Soho. Field was called upon to assist in Goody's defence in the aftermath of the airport job, which was a robbery carried out on the 27th of November 1962 at BOAC Comet House, Hatton Cross, London Airport. This was the big practice robbery that the South West Gang had done before the Great Train Robbery. Field was successful in arranging bail for Goody and Charlie Wilson. In 2014, Douglas Goody claimed to journalists that the Ulsterman was Patrick McKenna, at the time of the robbery, a 43-year-old postal worker living in Salford, Lancashire. McKenna, who was originally from Belfast, met Goody 4 times in 1963. Goody alleged that he found out McKenna's name only when he saw it written inside his glasses case. It is not known what became of the share that McKenna allegedly received, but his children were flabbergasted on hearing the claim of their father's involvement. It was summarised that McKenna either donated his share to the Catholic Church over the years or had had his money stolen from him. This alleged identification of McKenna as the Ulsterman has been disputed, not least because McKenna appears to have no criminal record or associations and passed away poor. It has been suggested that a known associate of the convicted robbers, Sammy Osterman, was a part of the gang, and his Ulsterman nickname was simply the result of mishearing his surname. At 5 o'clock, Chief Superintendent Malcolm Futrell heard of the Buckinghamshire Police CID, located at Aylesbury, arrived at the crime scene where he supervised evidence gathering. He was then sent to Cheddington Railway Station, where the train had been taken and where statements were taken from the driver and postal workers. It appeared from interviews with the witnesses that about 15 hooded men dressed in blue boiler suits had been involved, but little could be gleaned. By lunchtime of the following day, it became obvious to Futrell that extra resources were needed to cope with the scale of the investigation. The Buckinghamshire Chief Constable referred the case to Scotland Yard. George Hatherill, commander of the Sea Department, and Detective Chief Superintendent Ernest Ernie Millen, head of the flying squad, were initially in charge of the London side of the investigation. They sent Detective Superintendent Gerald MacArthur and Detective Sergeant John Pritchard to assist the Buckinghamshire Police. The police then undertook a major search, finding out from the crime scene after having failed to find any forensic evidence there. A watch was put on all seaports. The Postmaster General Reginald Bevins offered a £10,000 reward to the first person giving information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the persons responsible for the robbery. Following a tip-off from a herdsman who used a field adjacent to Leatherslade Farm, a police sergeant and constable, called there on the 13th of August 1963. The farm was deserted, but they found the truck used by the robbers, which had been hastily painted yellow, as well as the Land Rovers. They also found a large quantity of food, bedding, sleeping bags, post office sacks, registered mail packages, banknote wrappers, and a Monopoly board game. It was determined that although the farm had been cleaned for fingerprints, some finger and palm prints had been overlooked, including those on a ketchup bottle and those on the Monopoly set which had been used after the robbery for a game, but with real money. Despite the big breakthrough of the discovery at Leatherslade Farm, the investigation was not going well. The London side of the investigation then continued under Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler. On Monday the 12th of August 1963, Butler was appointed to head of the police investigation of the London connection and quickly formed a 6-man train robbery squad. With Leatherslade Farm finally found, the train robbery squad descended on the farm. The breakthrough came when Detective Chief Superintendent Millen met a distinguished barrister in a smoking room of an exclusive West End club who told him that someone was willing to inform on the gang. The process of talking to the informer was handled by Hetherill and Millen, and they never divulged the identity of the informer to the detectives in their command. The informant had been jailed in a provincial prison just before the train robbery and was hoping to get parole and other favours from talking. He clearly did not know all the names perfectly, and a second informant, a woman, was able to fill the gaps. Millen said in his book, Specialist in Crime, "The breakthrough with the informer came at the moment when I and my colleagues at the yard were in a state of frustration almost approaching despair. The process saw them get 18 names to be passed on to detectives to match up with a list being prepared from fingerprints collected at Leatherslade. Hetherill and Millen decided to publish photos of the wanted men, despite strong protests from Tommy Butler and Frank Williams. This resulted in most of the robbers going underground. The trial of the robbers began at Aylesbury Assizes, Buckinghamshire, on the 20th of January 1964. Because it would be necessary to accommodate a large number of lawyers and journalists, the existing court was deemed too small, and so the offices of Aylesbury Rural District Council were specifically converted for this event. The defendants were brought to the court each day from Aylesbury Prison in a compartmentalised van, out of view of the large crowd of spectators. Mr. Justice Edmund Davies presided over the trial, which lasted 51 days and included 613 exhibits and 240 witnesses. The jury retired to the Grange Youth Centre in Aylesbury to consider the verdict. On the 11th of February 1964, there was a sensation when John Daly was found to have no case to answer. His counsel, Walter Rayburn QC, claimed that the evidence against his client was limited to his fingerprints being on the Monopoly set found at Leatherslade Farm and the fact that he went underground after the robbery. Rayburn went on to say that Daly had played the Monopoly game with Bruce Reynolds in 1963 and that he'd gone underground only because he was associated with people publicly sought by the police. There was no proof of involvement in the conspiracy. The judge agreed, and the jury was directed to acquit him. Detective Inspector Frank Williams was shocked when this occurred because, owing to Tommy Butler's refusal to share information, he had no knowledge of the fact that Daly's prints were only on the Monopoly set. If Williams had known this, he could have asked Daly questions about the Monopoly set and robbed him of his very effective alibi. Daly was clever in avoiding having a photo taken when he was arrested until he could shave his beard. This meant that there was no photo to show the lengths he had gone to in order to change his appearance. No actions were taken against Butler for this mistake, but in not ensuring the case against Daly was more thorough. On the 15th of April 1964, the proceedings ended with the judge describing the robbery as a crime of sordid violence inspired by vast greed, and passing sentences of 30 years imprisonment on 7 of the robbers. On the 13th of July 1964, the appeals by Lenny Field and Brian Field against the charges on conspiracy to rob were allowed. This resulted in their sentences being in effect reduced to 5 years only. On the 14th of July 1964, the appeals by Roger Corddry and Bill Bowl were allowed, with the convictions for conspiracy to rob quashed, leaving only the receiving charges. Justice Fenton Atkinson concluded that a miscarriage of justice would result if Bowles' charges were upheld. Given his age, physique and temperament made him an unlikely train robber. Luckily for him, as the oldest robber, Cawdrey was also deemed to be not guilty of the conspiracy because his prints had not been found at Litherslide. Brian Field was only reluctantly acquitted of the robbery. Justice Atkinson stated that he would not be surprised if Field were not only part of the conspiracy but also one of the robbers. The charges against the other men were all upheld. In the end, Lenny Field and Bill Bowl got some measure of justice, but Bowl passed away in prison in 1970. £2,631,684 was stolen, although the police report says £2,595,997. The bulk of the haul was in £1 notes and £5 notes, both the older white note and the newer blue note, which was half its size. The £5 notes were bundled in batches of £2,500, the £1 note in batches of £500. There were also 10-shilling notes in batches of £250. A quantity of Irish and Scottish money was also stolen. With a few notable exceptions, the money was quickly laundered or divided by friends, family and associates of the robbers. Much was laundered through bookmakers, although, astonishingly, only a few £100s were identifiable by serial numbers, so the robbers could have spent the money without the fear of being traced. There were 1,579 notes whose serial numbers were known, and the rest of the money was completely untraceable. The £5 notes were two different types, because in 1957 the British government had begun to replace the large white notes with smaller blue ones. The final changeover had not been completed at the time of the robbery. The white notes quickly became far more conspicuous to use, making it harder for them to be spent. Although within 6 months of the robbery, 10 of the robbers had been locked up awaiting trial, and 3 others were wanted criminals on the run. Very little of the money had actually been recovered. This led to the speculation that there is a great deal of robbery loot still out there. In fact, the money was soon seized and spent. Thus, the proceeds of the greatest cash robbery in British history were quickly used up, with few of the robbers receiving any long-term benefit. Less than £400,000 was eventually recovered. Over half of this consisted of the shares of Cawdrey and allegedly Brian Field. A further £36,000 was recovered from Jimmy White's van. Roy James was carrying £12,041 when captured. The final sum recovered was £47,245 that was found in a telephone box in Great Dover Street, Newington, South London. The £47,245 recovered from a telephone box included 55 notes whose serial numbers had been recorded by the bank in Scotland. This money was part of a deal struck with Frank Williams and Danny Pembroke. Piers Paul Reed in The Train Robbers claimed that the police were feeling the pressure because they had caught many of the robbers. They had failed to recover much of the money. While no evidence had been found against Pembroke, who was believed to have been one of the South Coast raiders, so the identifiable banknotes had been traced back to him through friends who had been charged with receiving. Given that the police had insufficient evidence against Pembroke, either at Leatherslade Farm or definitive connection with either of the two gangs, Butler was prepared to let him go. Williams convinced Butler to pull Pembroke in for questioning in return for releasing him and not charging his friends with more serious crimes. £50,000 was to be returned. On the 3rd of December 1963, which happened to be the same day that Roy James was taken into custody, the police received an anonymous tip directing them to the money in the phone box. The money was driven up to Aylesbury and taken into custody by Detective Superintendent Futrell, who wondered how his London colleagues could know how much money there was. He had to bring in bank clerks to count the damp and musty money to determine the final sum. Williams made no admission to the recovery of the money being the result of a deal with Pembroke. Despite claiming that his negotiations were responsible for the return of the money, Williams, in his book, No Fixed Addresses in 1973, claimed to not know the identity of the person who had returned the money, although he did mention several robbers to whom he had offered deals through intermediaries. He noted that it seemed to him that Butler was sceptical of his efforts, and then, at the press conference, Hatherill and Millen did not reveal the circumstances behind the find, and that he was never asked to talk to them about it. Despite Pembroke being The man identified as the assailant of the train driver, Jack Mills, by Bruce Reynolds, albeit indirectly. Williams only makes mention of the assailant once in his book. In this section, he confirms that with Tommy Butler, he convinced the man they knew to be the assailant, but they had no evidence to convict him. Strangely, however, he makes no further mention of him. The deal done with Pembroke caused outrage in the police hierarchy. It is hinted in several books that the deals done by Williams were responsible for his being overlooked for promotion, and that Williams was unhappy that his efforts were not recognised by Butler, but they were instead hidden from superiors. For this part, George Hathrill, in his book, A Detective's Tale, stated that the motive behind the return of the money was not known for certain. He said that the money was returned by one about who extensive inquiries had been made and who in fact was interrogated at length, but in spite of our strong suspicions, nothing could be proved against him, and so no charge could be brought. My belief is that he thought we knew more about him than we did, and thinking things were getting hot, he decided to get rid of the money to avoid being found in possession with it. Hathrill does not mention Williams at all in his book. He retired on the last day of the trial at Aylesbury. All 11 men sentenced all fell aggrieved at the sentences handed down, particularly Bill Bowl and Lenny Field, who were later found not guilty of the charges against them. The other men, aside from Wheater, resented what they considered to be the excessive length of the sentence. Train robbers who were sentenced later, and by different judges, received shorter terms. The severity of the sentences caused some surprise. When Bruce Reynolds was arrested in 1968, he allegedly told arresting officer Tommy Butler that those sentences had a detrimental effect. According to him, they had prompted criminals generally to take guns with them when they set out on robberies. The robbers who spent much time on the run overseas, Reynolds, Wilson and Edwards, had very little left when they were finally arrested, having had to spend the money avoiding capture and indulging in lavish lifestyles without finding employment. Much of Jimmy White's money was taken from him. According to Marilyn Wisby, her father's share was hidden by his father, Tommy Wisby Sr., in the panels of the doors of his home. Butler raided them 3 times but never found the train money. The majority of the money was reputedly entrusted to Wisby's father and also to his younger brother Ron, who coincidentally had saved some money of his own that was confiscated by the police and returned to Ron 3 months later. By the time Wisby was released from jail, all of his share had either been spent or invested. Marilyn agrees with Piers Paul Reed's assessment of how her father's share of approximately £150,000 was spent. Although the Wisby share was one that was not taken by other criminals, Marilyn Wisby is still bitter that her relatives got to spend a fair amount of the loot while the overall sum dwindled away. However, her grandfather used some of the money to buy them a house in Upper Norwood. Up to 6 of the robbers escaped punishment in one way or another. The Ulstermen, 3 robbers who were never caught, John Daly, who had his charges dismissed at the trial, and Ronnie Biggs, who escaped from jail and managed to avoid being taken back to the UK. Daly had entrusted his money to another crook. This man had betrayed him to the police and had absconded with the money. He passed away before Daly could catch up with him. Upon the release of the others in the mid-1970s, Bill Jennings got in touch with Buster Edwards, and Frank Monroe got in touch with the South Coast Raiders. Both said that they had no money left. Danny Pembroke went initially to America, and John Daly, at the time, was said to be living on unemployment benefits in the west of England. Ronnie Briggs quickly spent his share getting a new life. He loved his new life in Australia, although by the time his family arrived in 1966, all but £7,000 had been spent. £55,000 had been paid as a package to deal him out of the UK. The rest had gone on legal fees and expenses.